about your nervous system, which, quite frankly, is the most important, because if you don't have a nervous system, nothing else works, so what's even the point? It's also my argument for why biology is the most important of all the sciences. If you're not alive, who cares what the force of gravity is, because no one's there to see it, and no one's there to think about it. So there are two parts to this lesson. The first part is how your nervous system is organized, and the second part that we'll do on Friday is about reflexes. If you want a little giggle, I posted the reflex stuff already, and Mrs. Polgard and I recorded some high-quality videos. They're not good. They're terrible. They were like the week right when the pandemic started, and we were like, what should we do? Let's do all of our labs.
If you want to see what people look stressed out,
Yeah.
watch them.
Oh yeah. They're good. Anyways, your nervous system is designed to do three basic things. It's designed to perceive what's going on in your environment and then respond to the changes that occur by causing a reaction to happen. So if you look at this picture and then you look at the words, they're saying the same thing. Let's say that you picked up, or there was a drink in front of you. I got this delicious peppermint mocha from Mrs. Weidman, the office administrator. She went to Starbucks this morning and it made my whole day better. Anyways, I saw the Starbucks with my eye. The sensory function was my eye, so my sensory receptors in my eye detecting the wonderful Starbucks and sending the signal to my nervous system. Now here it shows just a giant picture of a brain, and we'll get specific about which part of your brain or spinal cord signals are going to. But the sensory function was these receptors that detected the light that was bouncing off of the Starbucks, sent the signal to my brain. The integrative function is where the brain got involved. That's where my brain determined, ooh, that's Starbucks, thought, I like Starbucks, and then told my hand, pick the Starbucks up, please. Then the signal went out to my arm and hand, and that's when the motor function occurred. So the effector, in this case, it was my muscles that are in my hand. Muscles are very frequently the effector, but they're not the only thing that could be causing the effect to happen. Sometimes it's a gland, but for now we're going to focus on muscles as the effector. So what happened? Detected Starbucks, thought about how great Starbucks is, picked Starbucks up. I sensed, integrated, and had a motor reaction, and that is basically what your nervous system does, but a billion trillion times every second of every day about everything that's going on in your environment. Your nervous system is awesome. Now, does anyone want to ask questions there? Now that was the very simple description of what your nervous system does. Obviously, you can see what's on the board. We're going to get into some details about how the cells do this. Spencer, do you have a question? No? So, how is your nervous system organized? There is a picture like this on page 367 of the textbook, if you ever want to see another copy of it. And what I'm going to do is talk about sort of each piece of this organizational chart one bit at a time. Your nervous system overall can be divided into two parts. Your central nervous system conveniently is in the center of your body, so it's named very aptly. It consists of your brain and your spinal cord. Because scientists like abbreviations, maybe we don't like writing words, we like symbols. The central nervous system, very often referred to as CNS. It is acceptable for you to use that if you are responding to a question. I know what it stands for, so please feel free to use that abbreviation. Your peripheral nervous system, which you can abbreviate PNS, and that's often how it's abbreviated in context or text that you'll read, is the other part. And conveniently, it is on the periphery, the outside, the edges of your body. So central nervous system is in the middle, peripheral is on the sides or the outside. Your central nervous system is the part that does integration. So you saw a picture of the brain and spinal cord on the first slide. The peripheral nervous system is the part that handles sensory reception, so detecting the stimulus, and motor reaction, so making something happen. Now we're going to talk about how the peripheral nervous system in particular is split up into different parts. So before I go to the next slide where we're going to look at the same diagram, but we're just going to zoom in on some parts. Would anyone like to ask questions about anything that's up there so far? Yeah. So folks, if you look at underneath the peripheral nervous system, it gets subdivided into a bunch of different sections. And so I'm going to talk about each of those kind of one at a time. The first division will be the division between sensory and motor pathways, then somatic and autonomic, then sympathetic and parasympathetic, which Father Troy mentioned this morning. So we'll take a look at each of these divisions. One thing that I want to mention, because sometimes it's not clear, your central nervous system is made up of your brain and spinal cord. What is your peripheral nervous system made up of? Nerves. Nerves is what makes up your peripheral nervous system. Now I say that on the next slide anyways, but just in case you were like, well, what are the pieces that go here? Because we already said brain and spinal cord are in that section. Nerves go on the other side. Now, like I said, same diagram is going to show up, but I'm just going to zoom in on the section that we're looking at here. So I'm going to go to the next slide because the same picture will be there. So see, I've just zoomed in on the peripheral nervous system section. If we consider the first division, your peripheral nervous system, remember, needs to detect stimuli and then cause a response to those stimuli. So there have to be sensory pathways that have sensory receptors attached to them. Your main sensory receptors are in your head and in your extremities. Your head has most of them, right? Your head has olfactory receptors in your nose. It has photoreceptors in your eyes. In your ears, you have these things called mechanoreceptors that let you both hear and keep your balance, and we'll talk about both of those things. Your skin has a bunch of different types of receptors. And so the details of sensory receptors will come back when we talk about that in chapter 12. But there are lots of different types of receptors. When I say extremities, often we're talking about your hands. Your hands have lots of sensory receptors on them as well. So a sensory pathway is one that's connected to a sensory receptor. It's going to bring information from the environment to your brain or spinal cord, like the diagram on the first page. Now, if we consider the motor pathways, perhaps you hear the word motor and you're like, I don't have a car inside of me, but motor means movement. Anytime we're talking about movement, we could use the word motor. And it doesn't have to be the movement of a muscle, although it very often is. But these motor pathways cause things to happen. So if you look at the motor pathway division, I've put a number 2 and 3 there. Number 2, your somatic nervous system, has the word voluntary there in brackets. Voluntary means you can control it. It doesn't mean that you need to all the time, and we'll see that with reflexes in our little activity on Friday, but it means that you can. So if you can control, let's say, a muscle, that means it's your somatic nervous system that is functioning. Soma means body, and so I know sometimes, like when we talk about what a somatic cell is, the word body is not super descriptive. The whole body is your body. But this is your somatic nervous system. It's nerves that carry information and commands to skeletal muscles. So ones that are attached to bones, ones that you control. So maybe you remember in Bio30 hearing about the different types of muscles and how some of them function on a more voluntary basis. That's what number 2 is talking about. The other motor pathways are part of your autonomic nervous system, which is more of an involuntary thing. You have involuntary control, which means it's happening automatically. Your brain is doing stuff, but you are not thinking about it. You are not like, hey, smooth muscles of my intestines, please do peristalsis. You're not actively controlling that. It's happening automatically. So your autonomic nervous system involves the involuntary control of glandular secretions. So we're going to talk more and more about glands. Glands are things, for example, that produce hormones, that secrete enzymes. And you've heard about some of these glands before, like maybe you remember in Bio30 talking about your salivary glands that produce this enzyme that helps to break down carbohydrates. Also the functioning of smooth and cardiac muscles. So where do I find smooth muscles? Well, I just said inside of my digestive system, there are lots of smooth muscles. Once you swallow your food, you are really not in control of where the food is going anymore. The chewing and swallowing part, that's your somatic nervous system, that's voluntary. But once you swallow it, the smooth muscles in your esophagus take over and start pushing the food down. Then you have smooth muscles in your stomach and your intestines that mix it up and push it on further till it gets all the way to the end of your digestive tract. You also have cardiac muscles, so your heart muscles. So there are lots of muscles that are not voluntary in your body, and that they would be part of the autonomic nervous system. Now, some of the other glands that we'll talk about aren't ones that you've heard of before, and we'll also talk about some parts of your brain that are involved in controlling it. Usually, when we're talking about your autonomic nervous system, there's something called your hypothalamus and something called the spinal bulb, or more commonly the medulla. Maybe you've heard of that before. But you have these parts of your brain that send these signals to these automatic functioning parts. Now that is the way we would divide the motor pathways up. Now here in brackets, this is just for interest. You would never have to answer this on a test, although I had to know this in university. I had to know what the 12 pairs of cranial nerves were, and our teacher told us this stupid little acronym that I still remember. It was OOO to try and find a green violin, so hurry. And that was the first letter of all of the cranial nerves. They have fun names like trigeminal and oculomotor and glossopharyngeal, but that's beyond the scope of our course. But just so you have an idea of how many nerves there are coming out of your brain and spinal cord, those are all of the nerves. And each nerve is a big bundle of neurons, which we'll talk about after. Now I think, just based on time, that we are not going to get to talking about sympathetic and parasympathetic today. Bummer, because Father Troy mentioned it. But they are really the topic of that worksheet that I gave you. So clearly, you do not have to have that worksheet finished for Friday. We'll work on it after. In our class on Friday,